the sound on? Yeah. So it's noteworthy because even though we may have critique and criticism of this country, and I'm sure there are plenty to things that can be corrected, and much abuse, but the fact of the matter is, at least on a formal and official level, we do have these basic rights. Now, I'm sure there are all these conspiracy theories that there are no rights at all in this country and so on, but I could just speak as a Jew. I could sit here and speak anything I like to say, and we can gather together and study Torah or send our children to any school we wish, and that was non-existent just even a century ago in many countries, and several centuries ago in no countries. So no matter how you want to twist it, it would be an injustice to argue that this country has not been a blessing for so many people in that form of expression of freedom. Because again, even though there's much to be desired in many aspects that we all can find things to grow and repair, but that basic element is there, and it's unprecedented. We take it for granted. We're all born into it. My parents were not. They were born in the former Soviet Union under Stalin. And we all know what was going on in Europe 70 years ago under Hitler and the Germans. So, and you go back, as I said, a century or more, you go back to Tsarist Russia and Eastern Europe and Central Europe and the countries across the world. As I said, were ruled by individuals. Sometimes they were benevolent, but it was completely up to their whim, and sometimes they weren't. And that's the story of history, basically, for thousands of years. So it is important to acknowledge this gift, and above all, to appreciate it and to make sure that we use it to its fullest. However, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to ask the basic question: are we really free? Because you can have freedom from a oppressive government or dictators and leaders who impose themselves on us, and that doesn't mean necessarily that you're free from within. So, though there are guaranteed rights, we all have the right to freedom of speech and the freedom of religion and the other freedoms that I mentioned, to the extent, sometimes even to an obscene extent. Some of you may remember Skokie, the story when the Nazis, when Germans, so-called neo-Nazis in the United States, decided to march in a very Jewish neighborhood in Skokie, and it was a big uproar. It was in the 70s. You're all too young to remember, but I remember it, and it was a big issue because everybody knows what they stood for. They're calling for the death of the Jews and all the other anti-Semitic and racist statements. But the defense was that basically freedom of speech allows for people to express themselves even if their opinions are abhorrent or obscene to us. And that itself, of course, ignites a debate: to what extent can anyone say anything, and so on. But that debate continues to rage, and you have to argue that it's true that in the name of freedoms, we have to sometimes tolerate something, not because we agree with it, but because if you don't tolerate it, then the question is who's going to decide what should not be tolerated tomorrow. As people can suddenly decide that this religion or this expression or this idea or this faith is not acceptable. So, regardless of all this, as I said, the Pandora's box and all the complications, overall, the country has provided a haven and an opportunity for the freedoms I mentioned before. But, as I said, the big question is, you can have freedom from without. The question is whether you have freedom from within. And that no government and no law and no rule can dictate. In other words, even if you're given all the rights, you can do whatever you like, you still have your inner psyche. And you still have the inner demons and fears and insecurities and inhibitions that can cause one to be deeply enslaved and feel like hostage to forces that are far harder to overcome. So as abhorrent and has horrible history, the different leaders who ruled with the iron fist and who actually abused their power, that was still ultimately a force from without. But within is a whole different battle and a whole different question. So, focusing on Independence Day, the basics you can read in many places. What I'd like to address, especially from a Torah perspective, from a Jewish perspective, is inner freedom. Do we really feel free? And of course, the real definition of freedom doesn't mean freedom simply mean that you have no shackles and no chains that tie you and lock you behind the bars, or is freedom something far deeper? As I said, you can be roaming the streets and you can technically do whatever you like, but nevertheless not feel free at all. There's an interesting statement in the Mishnah in the Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, that says, "Ein lecha ben chayrin," no one is free, ela misha esek b'ter. You don't have a free person except the one that is esek, that is studies, immerses himself in the study of Torah. A pretty provocative statement, because it's making a statement that there is no one free except someone does that. The interesting thing, it doesn't say that if you study Torah you become free. It says, but there's no one free without the study of Torah. So it's a good way to open the discussion. What does this mean? And what is it actually true? And many people consider themselves free spirits and feel very free within, and they don't have no connection to what one would call Torah. They may not even know what the word means. And as I said, it doesn't say that anyone who studies Torah is free. That doesn't say. But without Torah, you can't be free. That's what it states. So the real question is, what does the word freedom mean, and independence? And especially appropriate in this period of time, July 4th, usually comes out in this time, sometimes actually not in the 3 weeks. Then the Jewish calendar, there's also a particular unique time period. It's called the 3 weeks. As I discussed last week, 3 weeks began last Tuesday, a week from yesterday, and will conclude in 2 Tuesdays from yesterday. 3 week period, exactly 21 days, 3 times 7, called the 3 weeks that are sandwiched between the 2 saddest days in the Jewish calendar. The 17th of Tammuz, which is a fast day, when the walls of Jerusalem were breached and other sad, tragic events took place, as the Mishnah enumerates. And the end of the 3 week period, on the other bookend, is Tisha B'Av, 9th of Av, the saddest day of the calendar. That's when the temples were destroyed, both. And again, other tragic events took place as well. So this period is called the 3 weeks, and it has particular laws. We don't make weddings, nothing, no special celebrations except those that we have no choice. And in general, not indulging more than necessary in life. And to recognize, to commemorate, and to, in a way, be sensitive to this sad period. Another name for these 3 weeks is called Bein HaMetzarim, taken from a verse in the book of Eicha, which we read and recite the night of Tisha B'Av, which will be next, as I said, 2 weeks, Tuesday night. Tuesday night or Monday night? Monday night, sorry. And in that book there's an expression, Bein HaMetzarim, which literally means between the boundaries. Or maybe more precise, between the dire straits. I don't know if that's where the group Dire Straits took its name, the Jewish musician. But Dire Straits is a verse from the book of Lamentations. And dire straits all evoke in us all a certain element of being trapped, a very tight place between a rock and a hard place. And thus, Bein HaMetzarim, because reflecting this period in time that is a type of tough, challenging time in history, in the calendar. As I discussed last week at length, I won't repeat that, is that the Jewish calendar follows the cycles of life. It's not just a calendar. It's not just a static calendar. It's actually a mirror, image, reflective of the cycles of life. And we too in life have our ups and downs. And like the cycle of a heartbeat, there's the ebb and flow. So there's the high point periods, like Adar is the antithesis, the alter ego of the month of Purim, followed by the month of Nisan, of Passover, the celebrating times. Adar is a month of Simcha, of joy. The Mishnah, as the Gemara says, when Adar enters, we increase in joy. And when we enter in this month of Av, which will be in a few next week, we diminish in joy. Actually, the statement is really a little bizarre. It says, Kashem, just as when we enter of, we diminish in joy, that's also how we increase in joy when we enter other. In other words, it equates the two. Why would the Torah bring these two things together, the Talmud? So there's a similar equation also between two seemingly extremes, and that is when it talks about the 7 days of Mishtav, Sheva Brachos, that after a wedding we have 7 days of celebration. So there's also, on the other extremes, Lahavdil, as they say, to separate between life and death, there's the 7 days of Shiva, which is, Shiva means 7 days of mourning and grieving. And there too it says that Moses decreed, just as he decreed 7 days of celebration after marriage, he decreed 7 days of sadness, of mourning and grieving after a death. And the same question, why bring these two together? I mean, life is harsh enough. When we're celebrating, we're celebrating. Why do we have to be reminded when we're celebrating, immediately say, just like there's 7 days celebration, and also know that there are going to be 7 days of grieving? Or as I said, just like there's entering other, joy is equated with the entering of ovens and sadness. So as Jews like to do, we answer questions with questions. I already have 2 questions, so I might as well throw in a 3rd question. And the custom that we all are familiar with. We just had the pleasure of marrying off Jeff and Rachel. So at the end of a chuppah, end of a ceremony, they just finished their Sheva Brachos, 7 days. At the end of a chuppah, we know the custom is to break a glass. And this too begs a major question. Why do we break a glass? And generally, breaking a glass is not always a symbol of beauty. Breaking sounds like breaking, something broken. So there are many different reasons given for the custom that if anything breaks, it should be a glass, nothing else. But the primary reason given, it's a type of commemoration of the breaking of the temple, destruction of the temple. So even like it says in the book it says in the Torah, it says Reishim Chosi, that when we're at the height of our joy, we always remember Jerusalem. There's even a song. There's a verse that says that if should I forget Jerusalem, I should lose my arm, even to the extent that we'll never forget Jerusalem. So at the height of our joy, we remember Jerusalem and the destruction that Jerusalem underwent during the destruction of the temple. So as a symbol of that, we break a glass. So this too begs the same question. Of all times, I mean, do it at a time, another time. We have to, right? I mean, honeymoons don't last long. I mean, metaphorically speaking. So you're standing under a chuppah, the highest point of a couple, and hopefully then, at least that moment, there's no battle yet, and everything is peaceful and harmonious. You have to remind us of destruction. You can do it the next day, in a week, in a month. Why do we have to be reminded? As I said, there's enough harsh things in life, and have to be reminded. Already things are celebrated. We have to be told. Don't forget. Don't get arrogant. Don't forget. Which is really the answer, essentially. One of the most powerful answers, I believe, that this custom reveals, and also the other 2 statements I made, is that life is a cycle. Don't ever think that it's one-dimensional. As one Rebbe once told a chassid who had suffered a great loss, financial loss. So he told him, he said, I think at the time, the first Ferris wheel, in the early 20th century, I think the first Ferris wheel in Vienna was built. I believe it was the end of the 20th century, or the end of the beginning 20th or end of 19th century. It's a famous Ferris wheel, a very large Ferris wheel. So he said, what do we learn from a Ferris wheel? We learn from a Ferris wheel, we should learn lessons from everything in life. From a Ferris wheel we learn that life is a galgal hachezer, it's called. There's a turning wheel. And there are times you're on top, and remember the wheel turns. There'll be times when the wheel will go and it won't be on top. And it'll go downward. You'll have a downward spiral. But then when you're in the bottom, you should also remember that it doesn't stop there. The wheel continues to turn. So in other words, it's really it's a maturity of learning to appreciate that life is not static. It's mobile. It's always on the move. And it's part of the cycles of life, like I mentioned last week, and I mentioned many times. This cardiologist who said to me, I wish I could just have a peaceful life, without any ups and downs. So I said to him, what do you mean, like a straight line? So he said, no, not that. Because you don't want a straight line in a cardiogram. You want waves, the wave. A wave has dips and peaks and valleys. Like I said, ebb and flow. That's how life works. It's only we human beings that imposed upon ourselves and on each other the concept of a couch potato. That I'm doing nothing. That I'm just sitting around. I'm hanging around. Nothing in life and existence is that way. There's no creature on earth. Not plants, not minerals. Well, minerals, you could say, don't go through any type of life changes. But who knows what's going on in their dimension today? Well, you don't need to be... today we know the subatomic world, quantum mechanics, even mineral, is full of dynamic energy, pulsating energy. Nothing in life, nothing in this world is dead. Even what once we thought was inanimate is full of brimming with life. Except it's life on a microscopic level. So existence is synonymous. Life is synonymous with movement. Chaim, when you say mayim chaim, moving waters, living waters. Life is movement. You look at a human being, everything is moving. Even if you're sitting in a chair, you blink with your eyes every few seconds or less. Your heart is beating. You're breathing, and even if you're as stationary as you can be, it's frozen. That's life. I remember once speaking to a photographer. I knew a Russian photographer, a real brilliant artist. And he told me how sometimes he spends months staging a photo, looking at his subject and studying the person until he gets exactly where he's going to get him. And he says, and even then, and he would develop his own film. Today is new technologies, but this he was doing in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And he showed me a few pictures. It was a very interesting study, how he understands human beings through pictures. And he said to me, see, this person is alive. And every time I photograph him, there are no two shots that are the same. Now, obviously, the shots aren't the same, but his face is never the same. I never get exactly the same because he's full of life. And I said, and show me the opposite. And then he showed me another picture, and I'm not mentioning names, so this is not insulting anyone. He said, this person's a face of death. He's alive, but his face always looks like a mannequin. There's no change. And he says, there's a lot of death in this person. And happened to be that this person who I happen to know is correct. The person was he's in many ways he's dead, and he makes other people dead. I don't mean in the physical, he's not an undertaker, I don't mean that. I mean to say he's just a person that has a lot of bitterness and a lot of anger, and his face is a what shall we say, a camouflage. And so you look at people, you say the sparkle in the eye. What is that, the sparkle in the eye? They can be 90 years old, there's a sparkle in the eye, there's a movement, there's a life. It's an energy. It's hard to describe because energy doesn't always come out. It's not to be loud. It's just that it's constantly moving. People who are on the move, they're alive. They're always stimulating and stimulated. They're not dead inside. You could be physically alive biologically, but be a walking zombie. I feel dead today. I feel not alive. You hear these words people say. So it doesn't mean physically. It means spiritually. It means emotionally. It means psychologically. It means the mind. Is there such a thing, a mind that is not working? A mind, machshava, it says, machshava, thought, is a wheel that always turns. There's no such thing as not thinking for any moment. You may be thinking about stupid things or meaningless things, but the mind is always thinking. Always. So the nature, the personality, the ingredient of life, the personality of life is movement, constant movement. And as such, therefore, like that wheel, it's constantly turning, like the heartbeat, like the breath. So when we're at the moment of a chuppah with the highest point of joy, we remember that there's a cycle. It's not trying to remind us that, hey, don't be so happy because there's sadness. It's remembering that this is all part of a cycle. And even on a psychological sense, when people who celebrate and completely consumed with their celebration to the point of even a narcissistic celebration or a selfish celebration, and they forget that there are other people in the world that are maybe hurt and broken. So a person like that, you'll see anyone that's an extreme that way, when they suffer, God forbid, they also do so in extremes. And there's no room and opening that there's a possibility that there's a little light. So anyone consumed 100% with whatever their feeling may be, when the time comes that feeling is not a positive, they're also consumed. So the Torah in its wisdom and its traditions suggests and says, so at the high point of your life, under a chuppah, remember that the world is still a broken place. There's some broken hearts. Even though you're celebrating, it's all part of a cycle. And when you remember that, there's this form of humility. So then, God forbid, the day comes when sometimes our wheel turns, and it's not perfect. We are also not completely consumed by that. You also have an opening and knowing that the wheel continues to turn. So it's just a general brilliant approach to life. So understanding, it's like what you say about the Torah talks about the story of Joseph. So Pharaoh had his 2 dreams, and Joseph was the only one able to interpret it. And what did he interpret? The 2 dreams of the 7 cows, and the meager cows swallowing the thick ones, and then the same thing with the bushels of wheat. And he interpreted the dream that there will be 7 years of plenty in Egypt, which will then be followed by 7 years of famine. That was his prediction, and which happened. And then Joseph made this brilliant suggestion. He said, so therefore, when we have these 7 years of plenty, let's not take it for granted. Stockpile enough grain that will be able to survive in the 7 years of famine. And that advice turned Egypt into a superpower of its time. Not only did it have enough grain for itself, but they sold the grain, and that's why Jacob and the 70 souls, they all had to go down to Egypt, because that's where the food was when the famine struck. So the obvious question is, what's this so brilliant? These Egyptians, they hear Joseph says there'll be 7 years of famine followed by 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Brilliant Jew, he comes up with the idea that famine, obviously save when you have plenty. Anyone could have suggested that if you knew that there was famine coming. So what was so brilliant that because of that, Pharaoh appointed him as second in command. He became the viceroy of Egypt. And the answer is not the advice that was brilliant. It was implementing the advice. When we're living in years of plenty, psychologically, we do not think things are ever going to change. Which is why today you find all kinds of gimmicks to have forced savings. Why not just every month you put away? Because why does it have to be forced? Why does it have to be automatic? Because the psychology of human beings says, this month I don't have that much. I'll do next month twice, and that never happens. It's called yesh mochel achazman. It's called procrastination. The nature of a human being is that when things are going well, we don't really believe that things may change, even if your prophet told you so. What Joseph's brilliance was that he actually had the discipline and did not think, I'll wait till the 6th year and then we'll start stockpiling. He began immediately. Many of us will wait maybe the last day. You know how it goes. And I'm sure you all, I don't know if any of you are part of Procrastination Anonymous, but procrastination is a personality trait. I think I shared with you once. I was listening. You're a professional procrastinator? Yeah? Okay. Well, you're not the only one. So I was listening to this ad on the radio, which was just hilarious, and I just remember it very vividly. So there's this guy, like a 30-second ad for Norwegian cruise lines or something. I don't remember what it was. Yeah, that was it. So the guy's saying, okay, it looks like he's part of a 12-step group, and they're having a session, a meeting, and he's saying, okay, I've been procrastinating now for 2 years, 4 months. Oh, no, I've stopped procrastinating now for 2 years, 4 months, and like three days. Everybody says, welcome, it's like that. And then he goes on and says, and I'll tell you where I hit rock bottom. I heard this ad for Norwegian cruise lines that said that if you sign up by November 1st, you get a 30% discount. And I called this November 2nd. That was it. So there's a cute ad that gets your attention. Not that I went to purchase anything Norwegian cruise lines, but I thought it was good material for an article or for a talk. So procrastination. And Joseph's wisdom was he understood and emotionally implemented and didn't just say tomorrow, push it off. He did it. He understood the cycle of life. Even though it all makes sense to us, we don't work this way. Because we work by impulse and we work what is right now. If something's going well, you just usually take it for granted and you do not really have the discipline to prepare. Today there's all kinds of, obviously, advice and guidelines, and people are told, and you have lawyers and accountants that give dispense this advice. But going back to the breaking of the glass, it's essentially reminding us of that cycle. And that's why the Torah equates and puts together death and celebration, the other and of, the saddest and the happiest moments together, because the truth is it's two parts of one cycle of life. Just like inhaling or exhaling. You can say exhaling is you're eliminating the toxins. But that's also part of breathing. Exhale is just as important as inhaling. And contraction is just as important as an expansion of the heart. So same thing in life. The way the cycle of life works, Rotzeh v'shuv, as the prophet Ezekiel says, V'hachayis Rotzeh v'shuv, which means the energy life, the energy force, is tension and resolution. Tension and resolution. Rotzeh, it flows forth, it yearns, and it returns. And that's a healthy life. Every one of us should have a certain healthy measure of angst, not complete animal bliss, but not over to the extreme where it causes anxiety and demoralizing and weakening us, but a form of angst. It's like a hunger, a thirst for more. That's a healthy trait in the human being. It's a certain restlessness. And then there's the other side where you resolve the tension, where you resolve. And this is a cycle. And if it's not done to extremes, that's exactly what makes us really be alive. So the calendar works that way as well. But there's a deeper aspect to this equation of the so-called down, the peaks and the valleys. And that is that in truth, and this enters into the little world of mysticism, in truth, darkness is another form of light, is how the mystics explain it. As I discussed last week, in the Zohar there's an opening statement that says, in the beginning there was a lamp of darkness. A lamp of darkness immediately is, what is a lamp of darkness? A lamp usually means it's shining. It could be a lamp of darkness. So years later, the Arizal, Isaac Luria, maybe the greatest mystic of all, lived in the 16th century in Tzfat, and he revealed what is called the Seid HaTzimtzum, the secret of the Tzimtzum. What is the Tzimtzum? The Tzimtzum literally means a contraction. It's a concealment, a deep, profound concealment. So I discussed, and I'm going to elaborate further on the concept of the black hole. So black holes in science are relatively a new phenomenon, discovery rather. It's not a new phenomenon, it's been discovered. So it was predicted back in the 18th century, but then Einstein's theories, and later in the 20th century it was corroborated. No one's ever seen a black hole, because by definition a black hole is so powerful that it doesn't allow anything to be seen. But you see its effect and its impact. And this has become a big part of reality today. Black holes, some say there are billions of them in the cosmos, and they affect most of space as we know it. So there's black hole, there's a thing called dark matter, etc. But if you study, especially the Kabbalistic text some of them that I just referred to, and more, and especially its psychological application, these ideas have been documented years ago. Except it wasn't done through astronomy and through telescopes or other observations. It was understood in a mystical sense and a psychological sense, that there is a darkness in each of us, shadows, that are very profound, but they're also a form of energy. So essentially, they're also a form of light. Because remember, light is energy. The question only is it an energy that you can see or an energy that you can't see? So when a person has grief, for example, and God forbid anyone should ever have to have grief, or sadness, or loss, that's energy. That's not nothing. A person is crying in a very difficult situation. They really feel terrible. That's not numbness at all. That's very powerful. As a matter of fact, it can be even more powerful than when they're celebrating. And I'm sure, just remember your saddest moments in your life. You know what I'm talking about. However, it's not pleasant. That doesn't mean it's pleasant. But to say that it's not energy is absolutely incorrect. The problem is it's inverted energy. It's not energy of expansion and breathing and flying and soaring. It's an energy that crushes us, that weakens us, that demoralizes us, that makes us feel despondent. And all that sadness brings. A loss of a life, a loss of a relationship, a broken promise. What it leads to is all the feelings of whether it's bitterness or sadness or anger. These are all energy, but they're inverted energy. Call it a black hole. And they're sometimes so powerful, they don't allow anything to escape. They don't allow you to escape. That's why they can be so debilitating. They don't let you even get out of your own darkness. That's how powerful. What is a black hole? It doesn't even allow light to escape. So one of the symptoms of this, of course, is that you can't do the challenge is that the darkness is such, as the Baal Shem Tov says, that it conceals its own presence as well. A black hole, by definition, conceals its presence because it doesn't allow light to escape. What does that mean psychologically? It could be either a form of denial, where you don't even acknowledge that there's something dark. That is one form of it. And also could be a form of and there's no way to look at it because it completely consumes us. So the Talmud says, "Ein chovesh mater esatzmei," a person who's bound in fetters. A fettered person cannot free themselves. Why? Because when you're in a pit without a rope, no one throwing you a rope, how could you free yourself? When you are your own worst enemy, how could one free themselves? You need help from outside. Your subjectivity becomes your own enemy. So therefore, you have a situation that with what we call the silence that's associated with any type of real shame or real darkness, there's a deep silence. That's why in therapy, one of the key things in getting beyond trauma and post-trauma is breaking silence. Now, people who, and again, I'm using extremes only because it's easier to explain with an extreme, though it's painful to talk about. But anyone who suffered a deep form of abuse, especially at a young age, and especially if it's consistent, will go into a very silent place. Silence is the way they deal with it. First of all, they're silenced by those around them, especially the criminals. Secondly, they silence themselves because it's too horrible to acknowledge. And it becomes something that they don't want to even look at. And this silence is like a secretion, like a secret. The word secretion. It begins to create layers and layers that cover up a terrible thing, to the point where you grow into an adult, you have embedded inside of you things that you don't even remember. But they affect you all the time. Or they affect one all the time, I shouldn't say you. Like a black hole. You can't see the hole, but it affects everything around it. Some scientists even call it when a black hole goes into a feeding frenzy, anything that comes in its path, it will swallow up. Similar to like a drowning victim. You try to save a drowning victim, they're so desperate, they begin thrashing about, they'll pull down anyone that comes to save them, including a lifeguard, anyone. Not because they're logical, because they're irrational. When you're desperate, you're desperate. When you're desperate, you will draw everyone down, you'll drag everyone down. People who are deprived of love in horrible ways, as children, when they begin to look for love, sometimes it's in ways that are like a drowning victim. They're desperate, and that's why it's very hard to have a relationship with people like that, because they're very needy, and they latch on, and they also don't want to give it up, and they don't have the right boundaries that a healthy person has. I'm not saying this in any critical way, I'm just saying it as a fact, an observation, that people like that, because they haven't drunk water for so long, when they're given water, they don't know how to stop drinking. And they will hurt the people that they love much and want to get love from, because it becomes almost like a desperate need for love that sucks out anything from the other party. You have in Al-Anon people who are so-called partners of addicts, whether it's alcoholics or drug addicts or sex addicts or what it may be, or people who grew up in very abusive environments. So there's also support groups today for those that are partners with them. Books like Allies in Healing, and you'll see one consistent thing in all those therapies, and that is, how do you deal with someone who you love deeply? And sometimes actually a person like that you can become addicted to a person like that really needs so much love, and you're ready to give it all, but in the process you get annihilated because you're giving so much that you lose yourself. This is a real phenomenon, a real challenge in situations, in dysfunctional situations. This doesn't mean there's no hope, but this is simply a result of an unbalanced relationship which has not been looked at properly. The intervention in these situations is to create the right boundaries. Like one of the expressions they use is that love is not based on perfection. People who are deprived of love, especially in their young age, parents who are either abusive or just absentee, so people like that, as that child grows up to an adult, they are, as I said, desperate for love. and will grab it wherever they can get it. And especially they usually develop very creative methods. They're very creative and smart, and don't show that they're needy like that, but they end up challenging and testing their partner again and again and again because they're looking for perfection. They're looking for what they never got. They're basically they're looking for a mother and a father to give them unconditional love. And when they didn't get it, and every child deserves this, but when a child didn't get it tragically, the child always wants that. No matter how old you are, you're still looking for that unconditional love. Problem is, your partner now is not your parent. And even if they want to give it, and many of them do, there comes a point where you keep sucking and sucking that you can destroy the thing you love most. So the methods in these type of ways is to learn what is healthy love. Healthy love is not perfection. It's not that the other person is there for you no matter what. Sometimes the other person can't be there for you no matter what. You know why? Because they also have a life. And sometimes they have needs. That doesn't mean there's no unconditional love. It just means there's a way of understanding everybody needs space. When like they say on the airplane, first you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on your child. So if a person is constantly putting oxygen masks on their own, they can end up depriving themselves of oxygen, like the drowning victim syndrome I mentioned. So the key thing to learn is that love is not based on perfection, on a perfect partner. Love is based on accountability, on trust. Not that the other person is going to... And you'll find situations where people who never develop proper boundaries in love, usually because they didn't get love in the unconditional way that they should have gotten and deserve to get, like any child deserves. What you'll often find, I can't say usually, what you'll often find is a lack of boundaries. And ultimately, they write the script themselves, a self-defeating prophecy that another person will never be there for them. Because they keep testing and testing. It's impossible that a person can be perfect. But they're really, in a way, expecting perfection. And there's one setback. One flaw, like you weren't there for me, you'll see it becomes a whole federal case. When you see that, you know there's a black hole here, someone that's eating everybody up. And it's not even malicious. I've unfortunately had to deal with situations like this, and I've seen it. I see some people, beautiful people. People have unbelievable capacity. But because of this black hole inside of them, that they themselves don't even know how powerful it is, it causes an imbalance and a demand that are impossible to live up to. So the way one deals with it is to recognize you have this black hole, which is also not easy to recognize. Because as I said, it's challenges, it covers itself up. It's like trying to examine a shadow with a flashlight. As soon as you shine the flashlight, there's no shadow there. Black holes do not lend themselves to be looked at, because they are deep, dark secrets. But they affect relationships. It's very easy to see. If you're trained, immediately you can see the effects that it has on others. Now mind you, sometimes black holes have the other effect, that they don't want to have any relationships. So it's total isolation. The person doesn't have any connection with others. The interesting paradox is that sometimes it's both together. People who have constant relationship, but they're really not there. They're not present. Because they're protecting themselves. So on one hand, they're constantly testing, and so to speak, they're more immersed in love than anyone would imagine. But the truth is, there's a part of them that's not there. Because they're afraid of being hurt and afraid of being vulnerable. Now, I hope nobody recognized any symptoms that I just described here. But I see from some of you nodding and so on, probably I see sadly that some of you are familiar with this. I hope it's not about you and it's about somebody else. And not that I hope it's about somebody else, that's not what I meant. That was said the wrong way. I mean to say that I hope none of you had to suffer like this. But this is part of life, and it's unfortunately not spoken about because people don't like to speak about black holes. We like to speak about, when things are nice and all that, when the fireworks talk about July 4th. But the 3 weeks talks about it. And the fascinating thing is that we could, when you study the 3 weeks and you study the Tzimtzum, you could go into the throes of this dark black hole and uncover things that are unbelievable. That doesn't mean they're always pleasant, but they're unbelievable about the power of these forces. So a deeper explanation in the statements that I mentioned before from the Talmud, that equates the joy of other to the sadness of, that equates the 7 days of mourning with the 7 days of celebration, is that they're actually two sides of the same coin. They're both forms of energy. And that's what Moses was really revealing. That even though it's true, on the outer level, one takes manifests in a very negative way, and one manifests in a very beautiful way, but they're both part of energy in life. And the challenge is to harness it. So besides what I said earlier, that it's part of a cycle and we have to appreciate with humility the cycle of life, there's also something far deeper. That you could harness, you could enter into a black hole and learn how to turn it into an asset. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that it's a form of energy. Sadness is a form of energy. Where it becomes criminal, or where it becomes destructive, is when this energy consumes you, and your will, and your presence, and your presence of mind, and your basically your state of being, which is essentially what addiction means. What does addiction mean? If someone's addicted to something, it means that the object is controlling the person instead of the other way around. The same thing could be with sadness. I wouldn't put it quite that we're addicted to sadness, but I would say that where it becomes overwhelming is when the energy overwhelms you. And the challenge is, and this is the whole purpose of the 3 weeks and the 9 days and this period in calendar, is to enter into this place and realize that you can control it instead of it controlling you. That doesn't mean there isn't a black hole, and it doesn't mean there isn't challenges and there isn't darkness, but you can control it. And to control it requires two key things. One is humility. I'll soon explain why. And the second is harnessing it, channeling it. Those are the two key things. You see, the problem, I would say, not to be oversimplistic, with all of life, is the self. We are the biggest problem. If we were not subjective and had no self-interest, would there be problems we couldn't resolve? Obviously there are problems. If you're able to be objective and look at it very dispassionately, you can figure out, okay, here's the problem, let's figure out what to do about it. Why do we go to objective advice, whether it's legal advice or financial advice or friends or professionals? Because they don't have the subjectivity we have. You'll say, I feel so-and-so, especially in areas of relationships. Of course, I'm talking here now primarily emotionally and so on. So anything that's emotional, so you get hurt. Someone said something to you at work, or a spouse or a partner or a friend or something. So often we just react, sometimes unwisely. But let's say you don't react unwisely. You go back home, you call up a friend and say, this and this happened to me, what do you think? What are you looking for? You're looking for objective advice, hopefully. I should qualify this. That doesn't mean that sometimes we're looking for someone just to agree with us, so then you can just say, you see, everybody agrees with me and so. But let's get a little more sophisticated than that. You sometimes really do want to know, am I something's wrong with me? Am I too sensitive? Or objectively, was there a problem here or not? And then, if you're sober and as I said, humble, what you'll do is you'll review it, and then come back and say, you know what? I should react. Or determine that you shouldn't react. Most mistakes we make, let's be honest, happen because we spontaneously react. Impulsively. That's how we are. Because that's what emotions do. Emotions are impulsive by nature. Someone says something to you, insults you, and you're hurt, many will just react. Now, frankly, some people react aggressively, some people react passive-aggressively, some people react by breaking down, by closing down and withdrawing. But they're all reacting. Now, there's nothing wrong with being subjective. We're all subjective creatures. That's how we're created. It happens to be important for self-preservation. You do want to be subjective. You want to know when something is, you're sensitive, and you're not just what's the word, neutral about everything that's going on. You want to know that something is emotionally connected. But you don't want the subjectivity to blind you to the point where you can end up doing something destructive. So the Torah puts it very succinctly in the Deuteronomy. There's a verse that says, "Hasheichid ya'aver ein chachamim." Sheichid is bribery, bias, basically. Bias blinds the eyes of the wise, and misalav divrei tzadikim, and it distorts the tongues of the righteous, tzaddikim. The Torah is calling the person a chacham, a wise person, and a tzaddik, a righteous person. And yet, even though the Torah is calling them wise and righteous, even they can be blinded or distorted by bias. Which is why a judge or anyone involved in something has to recuse themselves if they have any interest. And that's why emotionally, when we're emotionally affected, to be honest, you have to say, you know what, I'm subjective in this situation. It may be clouding or affecting my judgment. This is for your benefit. I'm not just talking about for others. For you, you want to know that. You want to know whether I'm judging this right or I'm just being affected subjectively. So there's nothing wrong with subjectivity, and at times actually we have to follow our subjectivity, but you also want to be able to balance it, to be able to come to a healthy approach. Now, frankly, if all of us implemented what I just said in the last 2 minutes, how many mistakes would we prevent? Almost everything in life would be prevented. But we don't, because we are subjective, and subjectivity it actually blinds us, even when we know it blinds us. And we exaggerate. Sometimes something will become far bigger than a problem than it really should be. And of course, it all feeds into, if we have any insecurities of our own prior to this, let's say, insult or this violation took place, so it'll just exacerbate whatever we were vulnerable before, or our own fears, or whatever was going on earlier. This is common. I'm sure all of us can acknowledge, and I acknowledge as well. This happens to us. This is how it is. This is how human beings work. Now, the approach to this is, again, it's not about eliminating subjectivity. It's knowing that you have black holes. And you know that they have a gravitational pull and they affect your reaction to things. Now, of course, a black hole is a far deeper force, because it's usually something, as I said, that goes from a much darker shadow inside of us. But subtly, we all have these subjective forces that distort, that twist, that change things. How often, for example, will you criticize someone else for things that you yourself have the same flaw? You'll always see it much more magnified in someone else. I should add, there's sometimes the other way around. Sometimes we magnify within ourselves. People who are self-loathing, have very low self-esteem, will often look at themselves, take a smaller thing and make it into a major thing. And you go to an objective friend and say, it's not so, don't worry about it. You know. So what is the antidote to this subjectivity, no matter what shape it takes? The antidote is humility. What does humility mean? It's not all about you. Both ways. It's not all about you in the positive, and not all about you in the negative. So when someone says, I'm nobody, I'm weak, I can't do it, I don't have the power, I am a very damaged person, even there the Torah will say, just as a person has to know their own weaknesses, they have to also know their own strengths. Who are you to say that you're nobody? God created you, gave you a soul, made you indispensable. So your self-loathing or your self-destruction is itself a form of arrogance. It's inverted arrogance, because usually we see arrogance as pompousness and someone that is bloated with their own self-value, etc., etc. But arrogance can take on the shape of a black hole where it inverts. I'm nobody. I'm worthless. I'm not worthy, I don't deserve, which is often a symptom, again, of someone who's been deprived. And always expecting something wrong to happen. Or it can take the other way, the shape. The self can take the shape of over-exaggerated value. So we have to know both our own qualities and our own weaknesses. The solution, the antidote, is humility. Why was the temple destroyed almost 2,000 years ago? The Holy Temple, it says God's presence was there in Jerusalem, in the temple, and in many different ways. And then it was destroyed. Why was it destroyed? What could have caused divine presence, spirituality revealed on earth, to suddenly have to disappear? What could cause such a thing? It wasn't suddenly God decided, you know what, enough is enough, I'm out of here, I have other places to visit. So the Talmud says, sadly, it was caused by divisiveness, called sinas chinam, baseless hatred, which basically meant like this. To use an example, parents have a beautiful, lovely family, sons and daughters. they're getting along. Parents, there's no greater joy than seeing your children getting along. But then the children start fighting. They don't get along. The parent says, I can't be here. I cannot tolerate it. I can't deal with this. It's more painful to me than if I had a problem, because you guys don't get along. So the Talmud says, once there was divisiveness, there was no room for the spiritual presence. There was no room for spirituality between people who can't get along. The most basic thing of divine presence is unity, is love. There's no love among people, God cannot be present. And this is an entire, thousands of pages are written about this, especially in Jewish mysticism. How love between human beings is basically the same as love with God. One cannot exist without the other. For some this may sound odd, because you see so many so-called religious people who seem to say they love God, but they don't love anybody else, except themselves. So I tell you here for the record right now, the foundation of Jewish thought, and truth is, I would believe any spiritual system, is that love of God and love of human beings is synonymous. If one does not love another human being, it means you're not loving God. And this type of dichotomizing, or compartmentalizing, I should say, is absolutely unacceptable. As some say, put it this way: if you love God, then you should love what God loves, and God loves His creatures. So if you don't love God what God loves, what He created, then you're not loving God. So this distortion, which is not here is the place to discuss it, how a human being can decide to love God or love others that are that of the same family, but not love other human beings, is completely antithetical to the connection to loving God. Because it's all about sensitivity. It's all about not me. God means it's not about me. If it's not about me, you should be more sensitive to other human beings. If it's a God on your terms, then it's not God, then it's idol worship. You created a God in your own image that you like, so God is from my country club, and everyone doesn't fit in this country club. This is fundamental. This is a sacrilegious. This is the ultimate desecration of God by not allowing and not having the sensitivity to other human beings. So God said, you want to be in a temple, you want to have holy services, and you want to have a connection with me, and you can't get along with each other. No, it doesn't work that way. So the temple was destroyed. But interestingly, in the destruction of the temple, the expression is used, the destruction is in order to build something greater. Seisra amnas livnis is the expression. You raise a building with a Z in order to build a better building. Or the way Leonard Cohen puts it, that you need the cracks, because that's how the light gets in. So when things are going well and everything is healthy, it's one thing. But if things are not well, if the temple would have remained standing while the people were dishonoring each other, that would have been the worst part. That would have been like true cover-up. As if like everything is cool, everything is good, divine presence is here, we're doing the services, we're bringing offerings, entering into the Holy of Holies. The fact that people hate each other, okay, that's a sideshow. It was like a protest. Something has to break to reveal, it's almost like a market correction, a reality check, that something is wrong. People have told me the worst part of the year for them is Thanksgiving, or Christmas, or maybe July 4th. Because that's when I have to go back to see my family, and we all go for the pictures, and it reminds me of the dysfunctionality of a home where we were forced to smile when we were all crying inside. What does that mean? That everything is destroyed underneath, but for the surface, for the picture, we got to all look good. And for someone who's been hurt, that's one of the worst possible things. It's like they say the silence is worse than the rape. Because a crime is a crime. As horrible as it is, it's a crime. But we human beings have ways to deal with crimes. An infection enters, so our body goes into a mode of fighting the infection. But what happens if it does not allow to go into that mode? You're not allowed to cry, you're not allowed to protest, you're not allowed to say there's an infection here. What happens then? Then a little infection will become a major disease. So the disease is not always the root, begins somewhere. But if you intervene, that solves it. Or at least can begin. But if you're told nothing happened. Nothing happened. Silence. Then you can't even protest. You can't even cry out and say, I was violated, I was hurt. That is far, far worse. The cover-up is psychologically far worse than the original crime. And you can check this with anyone who's gone through this. As even though on paper may not sound that way, but emotionally it's absolutely that way, because you can't even cry, you can't even say something happened wrong. And then what happens is all your wires get screwed up because you start saying, 1 second, is something the matter with me? I feel like something is wrong here. And I'm being told nothing is wrong, everything is cool. So the temple would have remained standing with such violations going on, people hurting each other. That would have been the worst crime of all. So God said, no, that doesn't happen. This is a world of truth. Something's broken, let's reveal it's being broken. And that happens to be the beginning of healing. Awareness of the disease is half its cure. That's why breaking the silence. So the destruction of the temple, was it a blessing or a curse? It was a curse because it's a result of hatred, but it was a blessing because it acknowledged it at least. And said, yes, the temple does not deserve to stand right now. As painful as it is. So it's like, when we have to make a break with something, as painful as it is, when you come to realize that's what you have to do, that becomes the blessing. Because now we acknowledge there's a problem, now we're going to figure out there's a crack. Okay, let's acknowledge the crack, and now let's figure out how to heal it. So this is a major component in what these 3 weeks are about. Realizing, and this of course requires, as I said, the humility, acknowledging, humility. I'm not just going to continue on being a accomplice in the crime by covering it up and silence and minimizing and so on. This is it. Let's call a spade, and now we're going to address it. The second necessity in tapping into this energy, this so-called negative energy, is harnessing it. See, as long as it's minimized or denied, then it becomes this black secret hole. Nobody knows what is going on there. It can disrupt lives, as I mentioned before, because it's just concealed in its own concealment. And that's that. And nobody can say there's a real problem here. I can't tell you how often this happens when I've been sitting with, let's say, a couple, or family for that matter, and I recognize pretty quickly that there's something like this big elephant in the room here. I'm not sure always know what it is, but it's clear something's going on. And the worst of all, everybody is smiling. Or you start saying, is there a problem? No, things are good. They can't tolerate saying, and they've all developed their own defense mechanisms. And you see this in a family dynamic very often. And every family member has their own little way of covering it up. If it wasn't so sad, it can be almost comical. Because it's almost like everybody has their little tricks. This one is always busy with something, and this one is smiling and laughing, everything's a joke, and this one is withdraws, and this one's that. Everybody's adjusting to the problem without ever addressing it. Think of, let's say, just to use a ridiculous example, a family of 5, a family of 10, a family of 3, it doesn't really matter. And suddenly, just thinking of what is a ridiculous creature, a dragon decides to move in. A real dragon. A fire-blowing dragon. I know there are no dragons, but decides to move in and decides to take over the couch in the living room and moves into one of the bedrooms. And what does every other family members do? They make believe there's no dragon here. Everybody starts adjusting. This one's suddenly walking into different rooms, avoiding the whole issue. And you have a whole family figuring out all kinds of ways to work around this without someone saying, 1 second, there's a dragon here and let's get rid of this damn dragon. Or it's causing major disruption in our lives. This is the common reaction, because people don't like confrontation, especially if something is going to be real, something is going to really rock the boat. So what we do is we start adjusting. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in normal situations. Any healthy family, in any family, I should say, there's always going to be adjustments. You don't always have to call a spade a spade. There we go, adjust. Somebody, let's say, has a little quirk. The problem becomes when there's a real monster, and then the adjustments become part of the reality. This happens very often. You'll see families that have, perhaps, God forbid, a child contract some disease, especially mental illness, bipolar, or schizophrenia. Bipolar is a good example. You'll see the difference between different families, how they deal with it. Some, if it's a healthy family, they deal with it very straight on. Go to doctors, acknowledge this is what it is, it's diagnosed, and you do whatever it takes. This doesn't mean you heal it. Bipolar is a life sentence. But it can be controlled. Medication, therapy. And what happens is everybody, the family dynamic, is aware of it and they deal with it. You isolate it. So it's only what it is. What's the worst scenario? Worst scenario is no. Some deny that it happens. Some have too much shame. And they start creating these all kinds of false personalities and realities. Sides are taken. So this bipolar person, let's say, criticizes someone, instead of saying, 1 second, that's not appropriate criticism, everyone says, no, he's right, and you suddenly make distorted moral choices. What's happening here is a disease has now become and infiltrated and contaminated everything around it didn't have to. These are people who are living in denial, are not able to accept it. I've seen, for example, a healthy family dealing with a child that's born with a defect, let's say Down syndrome. So their families cannot handle it, and the parents sometimes give away the child, and they make a big secret, never tell anybody else. But it's always there. It hangs. The shadow hangs there. And it's a black hole. I know a family that this happened to, and then the children grew up and they realized that they have a child that's in some home. They were told this child died. Destroyed their whole family. They will not talk to their parents. The parents are still in their own little denial because they didn't know how to handle it. And I'm not judging them, but no one advised them. How do you handle something when something doesn't go the way you thought it could go? And then healthy family. I have a sister who has a Down syndrome child, brother-in-law. And I remember when the child was born, so they had their nights of tears, especially then. They named their child Bracha, which means blessing. And they actually feel she's a blessing. Not only there's no shame there, they embrace this child, all the children in the family embrace it. The discomfort when they come to a simcha, and they bring their little daughter. I remember my aunts and my uncles don't know how to handle it. So my sister says, here, take my bracha. The healthy attitude of just embracing it has made everybody healthier. Now this is not a comfortable thing to do. But it was a healthy approach and not become this darkness that just became bigger than it should have been. This doesn't mean there isn't a challenge, and I'm sure it's very difficult, and I see it all the time. But at least they did. There's no human mistakes here. What God did, God did. The Down syndrome you can't heal. But then there's what we do to make it far worse. Like I said, like an infection. Okay, you know what? I'm going to ignore the infection because I hope it's going to go away. And then it doesn't go away, God forbid. But I can't admit that I made a mistake, so I'll say, you know what, no, it's not there. And you start going to layers and layers of denial. What happens at the end? It ends up exploding in the worst possible way. Like lies that we tell. Something goes wrong a little, so you cover it up. Cover. At some point, you don't even remember how much you're covering up. You don't even remember the lies you told. It's a whole thing. You have to make a whole document of lies. Because truth, you don't need to remember the truth. Lies, you need to remember, did I say this lie or did I say that lie? So just examples of how a black hole can go in one direction or can go the other direction. The 3 weeks is the Jewish approach to dealing with challenges. You don't run away from it. You face the abyss. This is what it is. Let's figure out what it is. We'll defang the enemy by being aware as we can of that it exists. There's a black hole. It's having its impact. And we're not going to deny it. And it began with the destruction of the temple. So even though the destruction was no positive thing, but it was a positive thing because it was the true response to an unhealthy situation. The true response to an unhealthy situation is a destroyed temple, as much as we don't like it. Had the temple stood, that would have been the worst. Because that would have been, nothing's going on. It would have been like hiding the fact that beneath the surface is real destruction. There's nothing as complete, some of the Hasidic masters say, as a broken heart. Ever hear that one? They say there's nothing as, it goes like this, there's nothing as crooked than a straight ladder. There's nothing as straight than a white lie. And there's nothing as complete like a broken heart. So, a ladder, if a straight ladder is not good, a ladder has to be crooked for it to be straight, so to speak. And a lie, a white lie, is the most crooked thing of all. A straight lie, so to speak. A broken heart, there's nothing as complete as a broken heart. When you love somebody, love comes hand in hand with vulnerability. If love doesn't break your heart, it's not real love. I don't mean break your heart in a negative way. It means it affects you. We just want to have the benefits of love and never be so-called vulnerable. That's not love. Something that is complete on all levels. It makes you it fills you up completely, but it also breaks you completely. In a good way. Because it means you're immersed. There are stakes here. I'm involved, I'm invested in this. And if I'm invested, yes, if the person I love does something that affects me, it's going to break me. And you know something? There's nothing wrong with that. We live in a world because, number one, we're insecure, and two, we've learned in this imaginary world that you can get anything by the press of a button. So we don't like this idea of being vulnerable. But since when is vulnerability a weakness? There's a thing called celebrating your vulnerability. That's true love. Today, like the guy I always mention this guy that he's a cute guy. He's always looking for ways to entertain me, entertain everybody, entertain himself. He says to me a while ago, I finally found my, what do you call it, nirvana, whatever. He found his big thing. I have a relationship without commitment. That was his big goal. To have a relationship without commitment. Can you imagine? I didn't know whether to cry or to laugh. Relationship without commitment. In other words, his relationship with somebody, but there's no commitment. He can go, as I said, does the other person know the secret as well? He says, no, she doesn't know yet. So in other words, it's a one-way street. He wants to have all the benefits without giving anything. Many people would like to have that. I'd love to have love, but I don't want to ever be hurt. It sounds great, but it doesn't work that way, and it should never work that way. And I don't wish it on anyone. Love means, yes, you're emotional about it, and you're invested in it, and it goes both ways. At times it's going to give you great pleasure, at times it's going to hurt you. And there's nothing, do not be afraid of that. I don't know if you've ever seen the scene in, what was it called? Children of a Lesser God. It was a play based on a book and then later became a film. So it's about a teacher in the school of the deaf falls in love with one of the students, one of the workers there. So it's interesting dynamic of a person in the world of sound and the world of silence. And she grew up in a very difficult childhood, an environment where she was pitied. She's an extremely smart person, she just could not speak. And she always felt this type of inferiority that, something's wrong with you because you cannot speak. So she developed this deep pride. And anyone that tried to force her to learn how to speak with the mouth, she was one of those that resisted that. Why should I have to come on your terms? Anyway, they fall in love with each other. And all the dynamics of two worlds that are very opposites. But I remember there's a scene there, a very powerful scene, which was very really relevant to any, I would say, in any relationship, any vulnerable situation, where they finally break up because of the tensions and they just can't, they love each other, but it just doesn't work in the dynamics. He's going to parties where nobody speaks and just hears, they're all doing signing, and she goes to places where everybody's speaking and she feels out of place. So they break up, only to come together, and then she tells him something like, using sign language. She said that when she met him, she thought, that she found real love, she found the connection. And she thought when she was not feeling complete, she thought that it brought her back to her childhood, that when she feels vulnerable, she feels like she was like a flower that will just shrivel up and disappear. And through loving him, she came to discover that you can be hurt and not shrivel up and come out stronger. It's just a line that captures what real love is about. And that is, it's not about avoiding being vulnerable or having a perfect person who will never hurt you. Obviously you'd love to have that. Everybody should be accountable and no one should hurt anyone. But that's not love. Love means, yes, you opened up your heart and it's possible to be hurt, and you will most likely, but you won't disappear as a result. Because it's part of life. It's because there's a part of you that is stronger, and there's a part of you that transcends, and there's a part that gets stronger even if you're hurt. Many of us are afraid of that because we think if I was hurt, I may disappear. Because it, in a sense, feeds into the fears of worthlessness. If I'm hurt, It may expose that I'm worthless. It's not true. You hurt, and you find out you're still there. Now, we don't have to wait for this, obviously. It's not my point. But you'll see this in any form of achieving excellence. It always comes with pressure. But nobody wants pressure. Nobody wants rejection. Nobody wants pressure. Nobody wants to fail. But where do we learn the most of what we learn in our lives is when we fail. When something didn't work. And then you did not fear going back there. You learned what you had to learn, and now you're going stronger and better. And you see this in whether you see it in sports or in other scenarios where you become stronger and stronger when you deal with an adversary, you deal with someone, a competition that's better than you, and then you learn. And you learn. But many of us don't want to deal with that. We'd rather face a more inferior competitor so it doesn't expose that I could lose. But when you face the best, you may lose, but you learn that you're still standing. And you will learn how to be stronger. And if you're really good, you'll become better and better. And maybe at some point, you may become the best, or maybe not. Everybody has their best. I don't know if you know this case study in advertising. So Hertz is the number one rental car in the United States. Avis is number 2. So for years, Avis advertising was, we're number 2, and therefore we try harder. That's their line, we try harder. Which you can only say if you're number 2. Anyway, one day their board got together and they said, enough is enough. Why should we have to constantly be number 2? Let's invest in marketing and become number 1. Let's overtake Hertz. And they invested a lot of money, millions, to become number 1. Well, Hertz also has money, and the competition began. It's like Coke and Pepsi. And they did not overcome Hertz. Not only that, because they started focusing on trying to become number 1, what happened was they ended up falling to number 4. And then they got back together after a few years, swallowed their pride, and said, you know what? We're always going to be the number 1, number 2. We try harder. And that's it. And it was a matter of ego. Also, maybe they would have made it. They still make them number 2 at a rental car in the United States. Trust me, is making money. They're not losing money. So they don't rent as many cars. I don't know what the profit margins are. The point is, and again, this is not the point of whether you are number 1, number 2. The point is they acknowledge what they are. They do the best what you have with what you have. None of us are going to be somebody else. So this is all about the reality check of the Tzimtzum Arishin, entering into the dark, the fray, into the black hole of our lives, and realizing, something, you will not get annihilated as a result. And there's nothing to be afraid of. Now, obviously, we need to have, as I said, humility, and we need to have the strength I mentioned last week. Boyel Pare, God says to Moses, come with me, I come with you. You're not going alone, you're holding on to something stronger than you that keeps you going, and you become a far greater person. So, in the final analysis, basically, the 3 weeks where we are now is an opportunity to enter into the more shadowy, darker places that are not always comfortable to go to. But there's an enormous energy there. And if you enter with humility, knowing you have strength from a higher place, you can learn to harness these strengths. I'll give you one example, personal example. The only real loss in my life, thank God, has been my father when he passed away 8.5 years ago. A little more than 8 years ago. And I have siblings, we all dealt with this. And I can tell you one thing that was very radically different how I dealt and they dealt. My father owned and was a publisher of a newspaper. So as busy as I was, I decided to continue publishing it. Allgemein. Frankly, it was a completely ridiculous decision, irrational, but it was emotional. But it was also, I can't say completely irrational because I was fully busy. I have no regrets. But I will tell you one major thing I learned, which I did not expect actually. Because there were so many challenges with this paper, losing money to rebuild it, start a non-profit, hire people. Till this day, I still have to do plenty for it. But thank God it's slowly getting on its own feet, which is my goal, to be free of it. The entire grief and sadness of losing my father, who was also a very dear friend of mine, and respected him in many ways, was channeled into every day I had to deal with this and the challenges of keeping this newspaper going. So it was two options. Either I sit and think about my father and I cry about the black hole, or the energy was going into building this paper. I saw clearly harnessing real negative energy into positive. No question about it. It doesn't mean there was no sadness, it doesn't mean there's no loss. But that energy was literally translated into a whole entity. And coming straight from that, and it was very clear to me, it was not coming from it was coming from the sadness of it all. So I witnessed personally, in a very therapeutic way, the effect of something like that. Which is why I tell anyone that in a situation no one should ever know of a loss, but when there's a loss, the best possible thing you can do for yourself is to take the legacy, inspiration of the person that soul has moved on, and channel into a real action. Build something. And fight for it. I don't want to build something. Put energy. You'll see that suddenly the negative energy will be harnessed into positive activity. Channeled is the right word. And I say this across the board in any given situation. It's not easy to do. Because it's far easier to just grieve. It's far easier to just feel bad for yourself. It's far easier to say, you know what, I've been hurt. That's why the humility is critical, because that's indulging in yourself. That's indulging, just like some people indulge in joy, some people indulge in pain. As weird as it sounds. It becomes your comfort zone. Some people, that's where they're comfortable being anxious. They're not anxious, they start getting anxious. Like, why am I not anxious? Or like, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong going today. Something must be wrong. So it's about harnessing and channeling, which requires humility and requires objective advice. You need someone that can help you direct doing that. It's hard to do it on your own. Because when you're in it, you're wallowing in it, you're affected by it, it's hard, right now. And there is self-pity, and there's different things that come back to you that you want to nurture yourself, or whatever it may be. And I think it all comes from the lessons of this period in time. That Jews know how to celebrate on Purim and Simchas Torah. We know they know how to do that. But it's far deeper, I believe, to see how people honor their pain and honor loss. Because that's where you see what they're really made of. It's like the tea bag. You don't know how strong she is until you put her into hot water. That's where you see the strength of a person. And if you want to appreciate Jewish immortality, eternity, is that we were able to survive it all. There's great lessons, I think, great, tremendous psychological lessons. The Dalai Lama, anyone who comes to visit him, that's Jewish, he always asks them the same question. How did you survive without a country, without a nation, without a homeland? Now he's obviously asking for personal reasons because he's been in exile and wondering what's going to happen to his people in the generations to come. And the answer is because we dug deeper. When things were lost, we didn't give up. What happened? You could think 2,000 years ago, once the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, where were they going? That would be it. Dispersion, assimilation. And that's it. That's what happens to every nation. Where are the ancient Greeks, and where are the ancient Egyptians, and where are the ancient Spanish? Where are they? It's the nature of the world. The nature of the beast is such, once you lose the power and you get dispersed, you lose your identity. And here, people dug deeper, and they found deeper spiritual resources. They said, okay, we don't have a country or a homeland. We'll build very powerful institutions. Story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. In these weeks. So Jerusalem was under siege. It's the time of the Romans. And you may know the history. It was horrible because they had completely surrounded Jerusalem. Jerusalem was rich with resources. But there was infighting in Jerusalem. I just said sinas chinam. There was a lot of baseless hatred. And there were the zealots in Jerusalem that said, no, let's fight the Romans. Others said, let's surrender. You know what the zealots did? They went and burned down the storehouses inside the walls, forcing the others to lose their resource. The bread and the other foods that they had gathered. So they went against their own brothers and sisters in order to provoke them to have to go to war. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was one of the great scholars inside of the city, the stone walls of Jerusalem during the siege. He had connections to the Romans. From the times the earlier the previous emperor, so he had connections. And he knew he could get an appointment with the emperor's assistant. But you can't smuggle yourself out of the city. So what he did was, they smuggled him out in a coffin. put him in a coffin, assuming that he was dead. They smuggled him out of the city. When he came out of the city, he went and met, I think, Vespasian, one of the emperors. Maybe it was the future emperor. And he made one request, since they were friends from before and he respected him. He said, "What can I do for you?" So interestingly, he didn't ask him to spare Jerusalem. He didn't ask him to spare the temple. He said to me, "Ten li Yavne v'chachameha." Give me the city of Yavne, which was a city outside of Jerusalem, outside of Israel. Well, it depends, there's different opinions. It's outside of Jerusalem for sure. And its sages. Give me that city and its sages. It was a city, it was a scholarly academic city. It had like a university, an academy. And he was criticized by some, and said, "You had an opportunity, you could have asked him to spare Jerusalem, spare the temple." But Rabbi Yechon ben Zakkai, in his vision, and that's why he was who he was, realized a few things. Number one, that he can't save Jerusalem. Even if he'd be able to save it, he knew that it was God that was allowing it to happen because of the hatred. So what was he going to do, save the building? It would be just a matter of time. The building couldn't stand any longer. The decree had been passed. Secondly, he probably realized that the Romans would not grant him that. But he did something which forever changed Jewish history. One act. Had he asked for Jerusalem, he may have gotten that. They would have bought time a bit. But what would have happened later? He asked for the city with the scholars, because he built an academy there. And that became a model that we may be exiled physically from Israel, from Jerusalem, but we'll build our shuls and our synagogues and our yeshivas. This was the yeshiva system. That's what he asked for. He asked for the yeshiva. He asked for the university. Because he knew what we need now is to preserve the Torah, to preserve its wisdom, to preserve the tradition, and make sure it's perpetuated. Or else we'll be dead. Because the country is lost. The temple is lost. Jerusalem is lost. And millions of Jews were dispersed. But in Babylon, earlier they built the great academies of Babylon. And then he built in Yavne. And then you see in Jewish history, what happened after that? What really? It wasn't just, obviously God's miracles protecting his people, but it was deeper than that. Wherever they went, they built institutions, strongholds of study, academia. And that's what they did through the generations. No matter how harsh it was, we have tens and hundreds of thousands of books that were authored by great scholars throughout the generations. And when you read these books, whether it's Rashi in the 10th century, Rambam, Rajba, I'm going through, the names are endless. In every generation, first the Tanoim, and then the Amoraim, Rabbanon Savaroi, the Goinim, the Poskim, the Rishonim, Achreinim. Wherever they went, they established very strong academic and traditional foundations, strong communities, and wrote. They didn't stop writing. You know how many books? Books and books and books. And you read Rashi, you read Rambam, and you wonder what was going on while they were writing these books. Cities were being burnt, pogroms, massacres. And today in literature they have what they call deconstructing literature. From books you can see what the personality of the author is like, and what his mother was like, and his father, and how dysfunctional his life was. You tell me, read Rashi, and the hundreds of pages he wrote, his commentary, the lucid, poignant commentary, and you won't see. You'd think he was sitting on the French Riviera, in a relaxed environment, and just writing commentary. No, he was sitting with blood rushing through. They said more Jewish blood in the rivers of Paris and France and in Germany and Europe than there's water, with massacres, and had that presence. You have to say, what was it? And he was not detached. He knew what was going on. He cared about his family and his children and other Jews. But they were able to recognize that freedom, you know what freedom is really like? Freedom is not whether someone is imposing decrees upon you. Freedom is the freedom of your spirit. And that nobody can enslave. So what did Rashi do? He lifted himself up to a place that was beyond the fray, beyond the here and now. And that's what they did, like Rabbi Yechon ben Zakkai. They found a spiritual oasis and connected it, and that nobody could destroy. So no matter what was happened, all the destruction that took place, that couldn't be destroyed. And they were expelled from one country to the next. But the books, the soul, the commitment, how could you destroy that? What weapon can destroy a spirit? And that's what was preserved and maintained. Today, we have actually the opposite challenge. We don't have, as I said, July 4th honors the fact that we don't have a world like Rashi's world where there were monarchs and fascists and criminals imposing their will. Today we live freely. But today we have apathy. We take it for granted. And our spirits are enslaved. They are enslaved. Our bodies are not. We're not living in prison. Nobody's expelling us. No one's murdering us. Thank God. But where are our spirits? It's enslaved. Enslaved to the illusions of what we think is demanded of us, the illusions of peer pressure, the insecurities of a material world. And the more materially successful we are, the more insecure we become. Because that's what materialism is about. Materialism is, by definition, an insecure entity, because it dies. It erodes. There's nothing in the material world that lasts. They had no materialism in those generations, but they had spirit, and spirit cannot die. And that's why the Mishnah says, there's no one that's free except someone who studies Torah. You can study Torah and be enslaved too, because you could be studying technically and not appreciated spirit. But without connecting to spirit, and Torah is all about spirit, one cannot truly be free. Because then you are bound by, and you're trapped and held hostage by the material world in which you worship. The things you worship are what define you. And things we worship are temporary, so therefore you're defined by temporary things. The ability to connect to that inner soul, and therefore the ability to harness even the negative energies within us, comes from the humility of transcending what we think is valuable and important, and recognizing a higher truth. And that higher truth in turn informs us and helps us channel even the negative into something extremely powerful. So whether it's Rashi or the other commentaries, what they did was, all the difficult times they lived in, they realized our role is to figure out how to celebrate the spirit even amidst destruction around us. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai established, and what happened in that after the destruction of the temple. The temple, the physical, was destroyed, but we rebuilt spiritual temples in our hearts, in our souls, in our homes, our shuls, our synagogues, our schools, our children. You'll hear Holocaust survivors will say, our vengeance, they'll open up a photo album and show you all their grandchildren. That's the vengeance. That's where the energy goes. It's not energy going into bitterness and anger and revenge. It's not energy going into just denial. It's energy, negative energy, turning into positive force, a positive spiritual revolution. And the more they were hurt physically, the more spiritual, powerful they became. As the Torah says, so the more they were oppressed in Egypt, the more powerful they became. So that's our challenge. And today, in a way, it's harder because we have so many comforts, which we take for granted. To find that challenge within us, often requires something, unfortunately, something negative to happen. Trauma, loss, that usually wakes somebody up. So here you have in the 3 weeks a model of learning how to harness and how to first look at even the darkest places, and look at and find a force that's stronger than the darkness and the light, that allows us to transform even the darkest things into powerful forces. Now obviously translating this each into our own lives is the key, but I hope I've laid out some key ingredients or points that each of us can take and translate into our personal situations. And should you need any assistance in doing so, I'm more than happy to help further if you have any specifics. Obviously, speaking to a group online, it's hard to go into every particular situation, but there are general guidelines which this time period teaches us, and I'll be continuing this series in the coming weeks as we build through Tisha B'Av to the next months, because ultimately this month of Av, this coming month of Av, leads us into Elul, a month of love and a month of rebuilding, and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and so on. As the Shalosh says, that the mazel of the month of Av, which begins next week, is Aryeh, the lion. Aryeh Leib, the lion. And Aryeh is an acronym for Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hashan, and Rabbah. All built out of the mazel. Which mazel? The mazel of the negative. So the negative energy ends up becoming the feeder of the most positive forces of love, which we shall discuss in the coming weeks. So I want to wish everyone the ability and the fortitude to look into your own hearts, to look into some of the more shadowy places, and sometimes you'll need a friend, a trusted friend, to be able to help you do so. And the goal is not just to look, but the goal is to channel it into something positive, because every negative thing can be channeled. So if you're feeling particularly down or despondent or resigned, with a little humility and swallowing some pride and getting the right advice, you can channel even that into very strong, powerful forces. So everyone here hopefully doesn't have to go to that place, but we all have our so-called challenging moments. And this is the time of the year where we are able to address that and turn to transform these Saturdays into days of great joy and celebration. And everyone should only have simchas all your lives in a revealed way. And then should there ever be a bump, that bump should be immediately seen as a catalyst, a springboard to even greater joy. So it's an honor to share some thoughts in our intersecting spiritual lives. I already did. Again, I say the class is dedicated by Mark and Rebecca Belinsky in honor of Mark's birthday, 21st of Tammuz, and also a loving memory of his uncle and grandfather, respectively, 22nd of Tammuz and the 4th of Av, Chaim Aaron ben Sion, Menachem Mendel ben Meir. Philip will not be giving his class tomorrow. Okay, so that's that. And again, any way we could help you, the Meaningful Life Center, please feel free to call upon us. If there's any specific needs, do not be bashful. And leave us your any contact information, email, so we can stay in touch. And it's an honor to sit here with you, and hopefully to see you again shortly. Thank you very much.